Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Scrollers podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a really fun French Algerian philosopher, 20th century. We're coming up to the founders of deeper into the founders of postmodern thought, and today we're looking at Jacques Derrida, someone who developed the philosophy of deconstruction, and he distanced himself from postmodernity, but we're still capable and willing of critiquing him in light of postmodernity. But we're also going to be evaluating a lot of his own thoughts and quotes here. We're going to do a pretty fun tour of some of his ideas, aren't we, Ondar? What do you have to say about this
Yes.
guy?
Yeah, so Derrida, as I said, fascinating thinker. You are correct, never really considered himself a postmodernist. One of the things that I think will come clear over the course of the next hour or so is that postmodernism itself is the type of idea Derrida would have hated.
Mm,
Um, it's something of a useless term. It has very little consistency in terms of how it's understood, and most of the premises associated with it are arguably endemic to modernism.
mm,
Um, if we had to break it down into five, it has five. Okay, it's most well known for its assault on truth, which I think is where Derrida really distanced himself from it because he was absolutely a realist, especially a moral realist.
mm, mm-hmm,
But if we had to break it down into a series of, say, premises that we can assign to postmodernism, and as I said, I think it's a feeble term. We're going to go over several postmodern thinkers. You'll notice most of them disagreed with each other on what would we consider the core premises of postmodernity.
mm-hmm,
Um, the most well known is the assault on logocentrism, the centrality of words to thinking. This is the quintessential Derridian or deconstructive idea. Uh, Others include opposition to the idea of differentiation, power-based normativity, we call post-structuralism, and then lastly, the destruction of narratives.
mm,
We're going to be examining Derrida's thinking today and the thinking of a related thinker, Foucault, in terms of how that fourth idea, post-structuralism, plays into premise five, post-narrative thought. But we're going to be focusing more on their interpreters rather than on them themselves. I actually don't like this type of scholarship. It's not good for understanding. But that being said, all of the thinkers that we lump under the label postmodernist have tended to be interpreted in very similar ways, even if they didn't believe that or believe those ideas. And those interpretations are more useful if we want to understand how either both postmodern academics and critics of postmodernism behave in the public sphere.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But yeah, I can post structuralism also not really. Derrida has very interesting thinking on the nature of structure, as we will see, because he does think it's necessary, which is different from other post-structural thinkers. But anyway, post-structuralism can be broken into two parts. The first is the critique of a structure in a germane sense, and the second is the shift of the idea of structures into a power-based understanding. So I mentioned above premise, I guess the premise three, power-based normativity. Uh, Typically, when you say postmodernism, the idea that comes most immediately to mind to people who know anything about postmodernism is the idea that structures or truth is false and truth is a front for power-based understandings of reality. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Especially in respect to structures. With that being said, I'd like to note here that structure-based thinking is not necessarily coterminous with thinking. So structuralism as a philosophy is a historically German in a philosophical, not in a national sense, strain of exegesis that sees philosophies as all-encompassing or totalizing systems that aim to circumscribe and describe reality. The most One of the most influential, if obscure, thinkers on this topic was Johann Jakob Brucker. I'm sorry, German thinkers, I may have just mispronounced that. Uh, it does this by placing all phenomena within structures. This is distinct from other methods of philosophy which aim only at understanding of, say, specific ideas or at presenting an unconcealment of reality or pointing to reality. It might be helpful. So, if we think of philosophers as economists for a moment, it might be helpful to think of structuralists as central planners.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
This isn't the best analogy because libertarians are structuralists. I say this uncritically. Um, but it does work in terms of the average philosopher is typically, if you look at the average philosopher, both like in ancient Greece, medieval Europe, ancient China, amongst the Jews, the average philosopher was more like a personal financial consultant. Uh,
Okay.
their goal was to build up your either as not as another best analogy your truth and virtue and help you live a wiser life, right? Money is or well wisdom is the real wealth,
Okay.
whereas the structuralist was interested in designing a system, literally, or a structure that would describe the whole sum of economic transactions and enable them to all be tracked and planned, right? And I just want to emphasize that distinction. This is one of the most confusing elements of postmodernism is the postmodern charge was not against uh, basic thinking itself, right? So, say, like thinking in the Socratic sense, so much as it was against the structuralist style of thinking. Um, Derrida, in many of his passages, is actually more of a Platonist than he is a postmodernist.
Interesting.
Um, he thinks that he thinks that virtues, for instance, are outside of his deconstructive critique. One of his most famous sentences is "Justice cannot be deconstructed."
Yeah, and that wasn't
So
just.
moving on, so
I've heard that before. I thought it was just him being axiomatic, but I guess he really did. He had a place for principles to be outside, virtues being outside of his deconstruction. That's really interesting.
yeah, yeah. Derrida was he was a realist. He was a moral realist. He had a very critical, what we would call critical realism. And we're going to get into that when we look at like what is critical theory in the second half of this presentation. But Derrida would be more in the lines of critical realism, as opposed to, say, the relativism that people typically assign to postmodernism. In fact, the two words are often synonymous, right? People will say postmodern when they mean relative or relativistic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I was saying, structuralism like they want to place all phenomena that we encounter within structures, and they think these structures are inherent to the human mind. Those of you with some basis in philosophy will recognize this as a very Kantian way of approaching reality. Where they differ from Kant is they see structures as meaning making. So us naive chuds typically see meaning as, a real existent. It's out there. We encounter meaning
Mm.
in our day-to-day life, right? Uh, the structuralists instead insist that meaning is something made. He was not a structuralist, or not quite a structuralist, but Sartre's existence precedes essence would be a good summary of the sort of idea, or this sort of idea. We encounter the world, and using the signs inherent to it, we derive values or meanings. So yeah, because
Yeah,
these
that's
structures are
fascinating.
inherent, they're universal. Oh,
Sorry, just saying that's fascinating. Yeah, sorry.
yeah, they're universal, timeless, and human. What we call postmodernity challenged all three.
Hmm.
It's best known for denying universal timeless values. It's not as well known to the general populace that it denied human dignity and the notion of the human. Um,
Mm.
Mostly because the intersection of what we call postmodern thinking with veganism and vegan or animal rights, we call critical animal theory or wild animal liberation, is one of the less well-known branches of postmodernity. Um, Derrida, as far as I'm aware, Derrida never spoke on that subject. I could definitely be wrong, though. Actually, I'm probably wrong. I'm all but certainly wrong. Uh, but other thinkers, Deleuze was a quintessential thinker here, drawing from another thinker called von Uexküll, who did believe in human dignity, but Deleuze interpreted him very differently. But so what is the actual argument for this charge against structuralism, and how does it relate to Derrida? And the answer is going to be because the typical postmodernist assault upon the notion that we had these structures in the mind that are descriptive of reality is by deconstructing the ideas within the structure and showing either how they differ from case to case, or how they intersected with other ideas. So one of the most famous examples, or almost infamous from Derrida's own life, was how he showed how Marxist ideas had come to intersect with all sorts of non-Marxist fields, which he called hauntology, the specter of Marxism in European thought. What's less well known is he also thought this worked in reverse, which meant he thought Marxism had become inherently capitalistic because he deconstructed the dichotomy between Marxism and capitalism, or between Marxist and non-Marxist modes of thought.
Mm.
Um, and again, spotlighting how, differences between ideas and interpretation. You will find all sorts of people talking about Derrida's discussion of the influence of Marxism on non-Marxist thought, not many talking about the reverse, which we will discuss more as we talk about narratives. So I'm going to give a couple quotes here that I think really
Hmm.
illustrate this, say, approach. So we have the Nietzschean idea, right, that ideas exist separately from reality, sort of in the human mind. Um, which the structuralists thought there was I want to say correspondence. That's maybe not the best way of putting it because that implies the correspondence theory of truth. I will uncritically, if falsely, use that word. Um, Derrida picks up on this and sort of uses these to. What's the way to put what he's doing here? I think part of the problem we have explaining the postmodernists is a lot of their ideas translate really poorly.
Mm.
Um, which isn't too surprising. Limitations of language. We'll read the quote and then we'll see about explaining it.
Sure. How about I'll go ahead and read it.
Now I don't know. Oh yeah.
Is that all right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, perfectly fine.
Now I don't know what perception is, and I don't believe that anything like perception exists. Perception is precisely a concept of an intuition or of a given origin. Uh, I may have a typo in here. Apologies. Of a given
No, that's
originating.
actually correct.
Oh, okay. This is just.
There was a typo with the perception and. I don't know. It should be percept. Well, I don't know what perception is. This is in fact correct. It's the punctuation that's bad.
Oh, fun. A concept
That's
of an intuition
that's
or
on
of
me.
a given originating from the thing itself. There we go. Present itself in its meaning, independently from language, from the system of reference. And I believe that perception is interdependent with the concept of origin and of center, and consequently, whatever strikes at the metaphysics of which I have spoken strikes also at the very concept of perception. I don't believe that there is any perception. Wow.
Yes, and that I think shows the radicality of Derrida's critique in a single quote. This was from some lecture notes given after the 1966 post-structuralist conferences in America, um, when he says, "Of which I have spoken" in that second to last sentence. That refers to the speech he gave, which is the second. The next quote we'll discuss in just a few minutes. But you can see, last week we spoke about Nietzsche, and we mentioned that Nietzsche sees ideas as these intrinsically false illusions fabricated by the rational mind as a sort of conquest upon life. Derrida includes, like, I mean, obviously he's going to include the will to power under these theories of ideas and of such things as life, because he goes farther, he takes Nietzsche, and he goes farther than Nietzsche, because he includes all possible linguistic concepts under his critique.
Mm.
Right. Perception is precisely a concept, uh, and it's independent, and it's a concept of something that's independent from language. Right. I know we say this is it's you said there's a typo. This is just a really weird sentence.
Yeah.
He so it's what it is. It's a concept of something, an intuition or a given, which originates from the Dangensik, the thing in itself. As I said, Kant. You can see Kant and his perfidious transcendental evil. No, that was a joke. Echoing through this entire paragraph. But it's the idea of something which we encounter out there, uh, and it's in and of itself and independent of language or the system of this is the system of reference, right? So there's this series of ideas. These ideas are sort of coterminous with language in structuralist thinking. We get this from a guy called Ferdinand Saussure. Um, very early and very influential linguist who heavily influenced Claude Lévi-Strauss, the quintessential structuralist. But so there, he defines it as a concept of this sort of idea that I'm wandering around the world and encountering stuff, and this stuff is given in itself distinct from language. And he
Mm.
denies this, A, because he thinks it is a concept, right? Which means there is no perception in itself or as distinct from the conceptual world. And B, he thinks that it's necessarily inherent or interconnected with language by virtue of being a concept. So, There's two levels to this argument. On the one hand, it basically structuralism was a scientific movement. It basically challenges the entire idea, not just of structuralism, but of science itself, because all phenomena becomes conceptual. And we'll discuss this again later. Actually, we can discuss it now. I can skip over.
Sure.
Typically speaking, we tend to equate postmodernism with Marxism, right? Not always, but like if you're looking at critics of postmodernism, they tend to accuse it of being Marxist. Um,
Has
Postmodernists
a
actually they deny they exist because they think of themselves as just having a given and necessary way of approaching reality, uh, which isn't quite true because, of course, they have their own philosophy. But nonetheless, if you find the few postmodernists who call themselves that, they usually refer to themselves in the English-speaking world as some kind of Marxist. Uh, this
yeah.
is a mistake because, or well, it's not a mistake per se. It's Derrida's argument here is it's a paradigmatic inversion of all preceding Marxist thought. Um, Traditional Marxism, going all the way back to Marx, was, I mean, we know it's materialist. Most people don't know in what sense. Um, it had two strains of materialism. It had historical materialism, which saw history as the battle between different, to aggressively oversimplify, history is the battle between different economic classes for control of the institutions. Um, and dialectical materialism, which asserted that uh, basically ideas are actually either resultant from or related to material or economic realities, which means that Marx, in one sense, you can see the Nietzsche and Marx, or Nietzsche did not like Marx. Actually, I think Marx. I'm trying to remember when he died. Like, I'm trying to remember if him and Nietzsche ever responded to. Nietzsche responded to Marx. I'm trying to remember if Marx ever responded to Nietzsche. Maybe in his. I'd have to look that up.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, Marx lived until
that being
the 1880s, so he would have had time.
okay, there probably is a Marxist response to Nietzsche then that I just haven't read. That
Hmm.
being said, I can take a pretty good guess as what would be in there based on what Nietzsche says about Marx, um, as life denying.
Hmm.
Uh, but anywho, Marxism it's a realistic and a materialistic philosophy which affirms a wholly material vision of reality with a materialistic anthropology. Uh,
Hmm.
this is important to understand, both to understand that, like, people running around saying truth doesn't exist are not Marxists. They may claim to be, but in the orthodox sense, they're not Marxists. Um,
Yeah.
during Derrida's lifetime, actual Marxists freaking hated him. Um, Also, a lot of arguments against Marx, which assume that he's necessarily identical to postmodernism, just flop. Like, Marx actually thought human nature was selfish. Always surprised to see people who think otherwise. But anywho, the postmodernist thinkers, on the other hand, inverted this. They see the mind as like it operates within itself. It can't move beyond itself, and thus the world of perception, including the world of material phenomena, is intrinsic to the mind. It's in one sense this is a form of idealism, but it's not really a metaphysical form of idealism per se. And I think it would be a mistake to attribute strict idealism to Derrida. If we're looking at the actual quote unquote postmodernist thinkers, most were not self-identified Marxists. Derrida wasn't. Foucault had a really complex relationship to Marxism, but was closer to anarchism. Same goes for Feyerabend was an anarchist. Um, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory were very pessimistic, individualistic Marxists with little relation to orthodox Marxism. I think the only major exception here is Deleuze, who was a self-identified Marxist, but again in a very idiosyncratic way. The Marxists did not like these arguments, um, not because they thought that perception was or wasn't a concept, but because they thought that this would undermine the possibility of revolution for the sake of the proletariat. If we were instead merely deconstructing ideas like, well, what is the proletariat? Um, which is a good question. Like, what differentiates the bourgeois from the proletariat?
Mm-hmm. And more often than not, nowadays,
We
for modern adherents to Marxism, it just seems like those people over there. It's just a exonym for the people we don't like.
Yeah, yeah. Nowadays, bourgeois is basically a slur
Yeah.
used to, which actually is very very postmodern, or the sort of thing postmodernists would genuinely have critiqued. And we're going to get into like what was the good part of postmodernism. I think their critique of blasé insult style arguments like that uh, is really on the top of the things that we can valuably take from postmodernism. Um, if you look at who a lot of Marxist theorists think are bourgeois, it's often the working class that's not like dying of poverty, or the working class that favors right wing or what they call right wing ideas. Um, you saying like a lot of 1930s right wing movements drew heavily from the working class who felt disenfranchised by their elite systems. And most of these individuals have been magically reinvented as the bourgeoisie
Mm.
by Marxist historians. And we're going to actually that leads us, I guess, into our second quote from Derrida, which I think really touches on like what was the charge against structuralism made by Derrida? Because we mentioned concepts uh, up to and including like the sensory world itself. Um, and what would this entail for, say, I've been focusing on political narratives because that's the best, or that's the most common example you guys are going to run into in real life, right? But we'll also discuss a religious example after this next quote. Um, did you want to read it, or should I?
Yeah. Give it a shot. If this is so, the whole history of the concept of structure before the rupture I spoke of must be thought of as a series of substitutions of center for center, as a linked chain of determinations of the center. Successive, successively and in a regulated fashion, the center receives different forms or names. The history of metaphysics, like the history of the West, is the history of these metaphors and metonymies. Its matrix, if you will, pardon me for demonstrating so little and for being so elliptical in order to bring me up more quickly to my principal theme, is the determination of being as presence in all in the is the determination of being as presence. There we go. In all the senses of this world. I wish he was using the German uh, convention of capitalizing random nouns when he wanted to emphasize them. Uh, it would be
Oh,
possible to
this
show.
isn't a lecture. This isn't an essay. This is a lecture.
Oh, okay. Maybe in
Yeah.
his head he was
Otherwise, I agree
capitalizing.
with you.
It would be
I'm a
possible to
big
show that
fan of
all the names related
capitalization.
to fundamentals, to principles, or to the center have always designated the constant of a presence eidos, arche, telos, energeia, ousia, essence, existence, substance, subject, aletheia, truth, transcendentality, consciousness, or conscience, God, man, and so forth. Some fun Greek there at the end.
So yeah, so you see, as I said, the radicality of his critique. God is a concept
Yeah.
by 2,000 years of Christianity. Now, there is something to be said for the distinction between, and I think one of the things Derrida is trying to point to is the distinction between um, ideas as manifested in language and the realities we think underlie them. Um, I don't really want to get into his views on the latter because, as I said, very complex and also very irrelevant to how modern day deconstructionists think. Most of them would be Most of them would be happy to just deconstruct the word and use that to claim they've disproven the concept.
Mm.
That being said, anyone here, any like, yeah, real quickly. I think we have time. Like Zen visions of language, right?
Mm.
The self is, the self is not the self. Um, the mind is not the mind. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there's the thinking of the mind, and then there's almost pure intuition or pure revelation, uh, kensho. And if
Mm-hmm.
any of our listeners have either practiced or know of Zen Buddhism, you will know that you'll often find similar arguments there. Not because Buddhism's a postmodern philosophy. Like I said, a lot of random stuff gets lumped under postmodernism if it hits one or another traits. You see this all over the place. Um, but because Buddhism shares a similar skepticism about language.
Mm-hmm.
But moving on.
Yeah.
Um,
Is it you could help me with this, but the hidden Buddha that is named isn't actually the hidden Buddha. As soon as you articulate it with the word, you're losing something by constraining it by those words, right?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. In the words of Yukio Mishima, who was a very, very, very controversial Buddhist, words corrode reality.
Mm-hmm.
That sentiment is very orthodox or very sorry normative to many, if not most, strains of Buddhism. Taoism is going to have a slightly different approach that we don't really have to get into, but I do think it is worth mentioning that even language itself is a and words are concepts that switch from I don't even want to say culture, like group to group, individual to individual. Um, and the central idea, one of the ideas that Derrida is trying to articulate across these and across his others and one of the problems with structuralism is it assumes uncritical meanings to these words, but these words, I mean, Derrida's words, il n'y a pas d'autres text. There's nothing outside the text. These words get their meanings from their contexts. Uh, like the center is interrelated with, say, perception, ideas of origin, ideas of being and presence. And this means that there's not going to be a universal structure.
Mm-hmm.
There is
Mm-hmm.
not going to be a universal worldview of concepts that we employ.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you can see this. As I said, we can see this posed. You often see this in. Oh yeah, one good example is March of Progress. Uh, all of our any listener who has an interest in philosophy is probably aware of most of the arguments against the March of Progress, I want to think, which is the idea that civilization is proceeding ever forward and getting better and better, um, from say primitive superstition to the enlightened liberal mind of today. We don't like to phrase it that way, but we encounter this all the time. Anytime you see somebody tweeting out it's 2024, why are we still disputing this? As if the date had any bearing on the truth status of a proposition. That's March of Progress. Uh, and, Derrida is going to come along with his linguistic concept based understanding, and he'll be like, but what do we mean by progress? What is the difference between faith and reason? Yeah. And these are good questions. Like, for all, I know people don't like postmodernism, and in many respects, I'm very, very, very sympathetic. I don't like postmodernism either. But these are still good questions because reason and faith are not ideas that have been interpreted the same way throughout history. The
Mm-hmm.
idea of an opposition between the two is modern. The idea that there isn't faith in reason is modern. Um, for instance, it's not in the Gospels. Which say that you're saved through faith in Jesus and then define Jesus as the Logos reason.
Mm. Sure, sure.
Yeah. Not to say, not to make a definitive statement about what the gospel says the relationship between the two is, but a hard line faith versus reason is just not the entire conceptual understanding for such a dichotomy is just missing from the New Testament. Uh,
Yeah.
it is not there at all. Unless you, well, no, no, it's not there at all. Yeah. Even if we purely limit ourselves to Johannine works and dismiss Paul, because of faith alone or whatever, the Johannine corpus still interrelates faith and reason throughout, say, the Book of Revelation.
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Which is,
Later, evangelical Christianity would build a kind of fideism, where faith kind of uh, almost has like a talismanic type characteristic. Would it really just uh, living more closely to the text? It's just another way to talk about trust, right? To a set of claims, or to to a sovereign. So
I
there's nothing
actually think
particularly.
it is meant to have metaphysical bearing in the New Testament.
Oh, you think? Yeah, you think it stands
Um,
alone? Uh,
yeah.
okay. Mm.
Well, so if we look at, say, the Book of Revelation, the book of Revelation continually interrelates faith coupled with adherent trust in the teachings of God, or Jesus, to the act of salvation, but then it describes these in very metaphysical terms with like the gifting of a stone. Um, in an antique context, that's not going to be a metaphor. Or it's not going to be purely metaphorical, I should say. Um,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I agree with you that to hold up faith as a kind of talisman distinct from, say, all reason is false, but I think the Bible has a metaphysical understanding of trust, absolutely.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That could be teased apart. Maybe. Yeah. Comparing with Greek contemporary thought, Jewish contemporary thought. But yeah. But I don't want to. Apologies
yeah,
for
yeah, so that's
derailing you.
no, no, actually it does kind of relevant though, because we're talking about one of the most one of the most notorious and aggressive applications of this was the dissembling of historical narratives. And this is like, we're talking about narratives here. I've been sort of going over Derrida's thought, but if we're talking about narratives per se, it was the dissembling of historical narratives that was of chief interest to postmodern thinkers, including Marxist narratives. Many of them argued with the structuralist Marxist Louis Althusser, who taught Foucault. But sorry. So they dissembled Marxist narratives. They dissembled progressive narratives. Obviously, they disassembled. I don't have to say they disassembled capitalist narratives or rationalist narratives. They also disassembled religious narratives. Um, and so one of the next week we're going to go into German historicism, which I guess means some of this lecture will be more intelligible the next time. But in the modern period, you had the rise of historical visions of Christianity, which portrayed the march of certain forms of Christianity in line with specific ideas. Dispensationalism is the best known example. Uh, and like Lutheran millenarianism, Hegelianism, and they disassembled those. And one of the ways they would do that, say, is by pointing out, we have these ideas of superstition, and I or like we can equate to say waving around your saintly relic or your amulet of Saint Christopher, as opposed to just having faith in God. But like, here's the intersection between faith, religious talisman, and the talismans of Saint Nick. Or another example would be how postmodern historians pointed out that a lot of the things that we consider characteristically modern did not come from Protestants, but from Catholics. Uh, and this is one of the weirder and more controversial conclusions that they reach these conclusions for good reason. But you'll often see, like, to see any online Catholics or Tratcats, you'll notice that they have this grand historical narrative of like this glorious realist medieval Christendom
Mm,
that Protestants destroyed through like aggressive subjectivity.
yeah. Yep. Very popular.
In fact, yeah, in fact, the shift to relativity occurred. I mean, not to say that it was exclusively Catholic, because obviously that would be just as much a mistake as to say it was exclusively Protestant. But a major contributing factor were Catholic. I don't say maybe slightly anachronistic here. Well, maybe not authoritarians. Catholic proponents of absolute sovereignty, both of the Pope and of the King, in France, arguing that human reason was insufficient to describe reality, and therefore we needed tradition to store, say, the basic or fallible elements of human reason
Mm,
so that we could think better. Right. They and You had other very specific Catholic thinkers like Gassendi, who proved super instrumental in defending modern ideas like philosophical atomism, the fallibility of reason. And then you had their Protestant opponents who insisted that things were inextricably from reason or reasonable or definable by reason, sorry, like Protestant rationalism. Um, Again, not an exclusively Protestant phenomena by any means. And then, ironically enough, the most sophisticated defender of, say, the Catholic architectural and saint tradition in Europe was probably the complete heretic and decidedly anti-Christian Giordano Bruno. Right.
hmm
Um, so this would a good example of a postmodern narrative. Another example, in terms of say how we understand Catholic versus Protestant history, would be to point out that, say, have you ever heard of the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns?
No, no. Do tell.
There was about a 150-year-long dispute in early modern France between Catholic circles as to what they called the ancient world, which is the medieval period, versus, say, the modern world. A lot of fame, if anyone here reads French literature, most of the major and famous French figures were on one or another side of this conflict. Charles Perrault was probably the most famous defender of the modernist camp. On the other hand, the ancients included the poet Molière, the poet Racine, Pierre Corneille, um, the uh, the Jean de La Fontaine, the famous fable writer. The version, the folk story Beauty and the Beast, or fairy story, was actually written as a discussion on this dispute. One of the fascinating things about this dispute, however, is that it was the modernist camp that defended absolute authority of the king and to a lesser extent of the church as the chief ends of life, and the ancient camp that defended freedom as first and foremost, uh, and actually linked this to religious tolerance as opposed to the obviously less religiously tolerant state authoritarians. And so we think, oh well, moderns were off throwing all these like nice values, but what ended up happening was that it was the ancients who laid the framework for much of the ideas of modernity that most of us would consider better, right? Like religious tolerance, freedom rather than absolute loyalty to the polity you live in. Those were on the ancient side, and so these would be examples of say how deconstructions. All
Mm-hmm.
right, that's the first half. So that's how we deconstruct ideas. The real destruction to narratives, however, because there's nothing really offensive in what I just said. I mean, the ideas about perception, of course, are offensive to those of us who are realists, but there's nothing really offensive about the idea that, say, reason differs from period to period. Uh, the real thing that destroyed narrative and the thing that reason that a lot of people really hate postmodernism is the critique of ideology or the critique of or critical theory. The most notorious defender of this was Theodore Adorno. Um, that being said, he was probably one of the least influential critical theorists because he was so pessimistic most about the possibility of Marxist revolt. Most Marxists did not care for him. Uh, in fact, ironically enough, his essay "The Culture Industry" reads like something you'd see from the modern day, like far right.
Ooh.
In spite of the fact that the far right hates him because he was a Jewish Marxist. Uh, a good example of reception of complex reception of ideas and the critique of postmodernism. But yeah, we can go to the third quote now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The theory of ideology adopts a suspicious approach, seeing tradition as merely the systematically distorted expression of communication under unacknowledged conditions of violence. Mm.
This is critical theory in one sentence
Yeah, it
from
is.
Paul Ricoeur. The only thing I will note is this essay refers to a dispute between the liberal critical theorist Jürgen Habermas, who was super important in the founding of the modern European Union as we know it today, and the Lutheran theologian Hans Georg Gadamer, which is why you see that remark about tradition. Uh, Most
Yeah.
critical theorists would go, Habermas is a liberal and believes in reason, and he wants to free reason from the wanted to free reason from the shackles of tradition. Ricoeur and Gadamer ripped him apart so hard he actually abandoned the view in this sentence and changed it. So we're not going to look at we're not going to look at Habermas because he's totally peripheral. But Just a funny aside here. Habermas does now, in fact, just with a very critical eye, but he does defend tradition. Um, he no longer adheres to the view in this quote.
Hmm.
But anywho, the more traditional critical theorist would see even rationality itself as the systematically distorted expression of communication under unacknowledged conditions of violence. Adorno talks about the ways we think as being conditioned or by the conditions of violence, and he seeks to dissect these conceptual worlds that we've spoken about and reveal which I want to say the real yeah yeah, it's almost the stock complaint is it's sort of Gnostic. I don't like that expression, but in a way it encapsulates some of what he's trying to do.
Sure.
Underneath the rational bedwork of our thought um, lies a very different world, which is distorted by our own impression. And this is where Deleuze really takes off with his theory that we can free ourselves through schizophrenia.
Oh, fascinating.
But yeah, that's Deleuze's quintessence and probably the most influential. Anyone here who's ever encountered, I mean, anyone here who's ever seen ideas like the cathedral floating about in the right has encountered critical theory, because that's just the cathedral is critical theory under another name. Um,
Sure.
but anyone here who's seen schizo posting or like schizo Christians, um, schizo spirituality, you get a lot of this stuff out of certain not to be named online discussion boards from Twitter. This is postmodernism, or it's more specifically, it's Deleuze-Guattarianism. It was his most influential idea.
That's great.
It's
Yeah.
not, however, Derrida's idea. Hmm?
Hmm. Yeah. I typically see it as it's a like a revolutionary response to the inhumane modernist uh, restrictions on human life. Insanity is the only sane response to the modern world. Is kind of, I feel like that's the aesthetic uh, dimension that's being explored with a lot of these online schizo posting type approaches. But that's just
Although Deleuze hated humanity
yeah,
as a concept. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it is interesting just how much not in Derrida, but it like so Deleuze. It's really interesting reading continental thinkers in this sort of camp because they'll go on and on about like how bad racism is, and then they're like, and also we should abolish human dignity and promote a world of just pure nothingness. Um, that like I was reading. I meant earlier. I mentioned Jacob von Uexküll, a very famous and very influential semiotician. Actually, very worthwhile. If anyone here wants one book recommendation, I mean, I'd recommend the Ricoeur book, but I would also recommend A Foray into the Worlds of Animals and Humans by Jacob von Uexküll. But like both the introduction by Dorian Sagan and the afterword by Jeffrey Winthrop Young like offer scathing remarks on Uexküll's racism, and then they're like also like we just got to abolish human dignity, man. It's like
amazing.
okay, but hey, at least they won't. At least people won't have their dignity taken away by racism. But yeah, anyway, this is the most paradigmatic example of the critical theorist. Then is we have these ideas, rationality, perception, so on and so forth. But these ideas are distortions that hide violence underneath, and we can sort of explode that um, this is, anyone who has encountered, say, intersectional feminism is familiar with this style of reasoning. It lies the idea of interrelated matrices of oppression. I wanted to do an analysis of Foucault's sexual morality and the law, um, and actually offer a defensive reading of the essay, as much as I don't like it. But
Oh,
how
fun.
much long? We have 4 minutes, eh?
Uh, y- yeah, but that's a what a fun way to wrap it up. Yeah, we could let's tackle it.
Yeah. Okay. So Foucault's most infamous essay is called Sexual Morality and the Law. It is infamous because it was, I want to say, it was instrumental in and sort of presaged the abolition of age of consent laws in France. Um, Thus,
Yeah.
this essay is why Foucault has a reputation in many quarters for being an activism for whoop-de-dooing with the kiddies. Um, we're not going to discuss how accurate that reputation is because it's a very, very controversial topic with a lot on every side. Uh, well, we are going to typically his defenders just sort of accuse his critics of being like far right reactionaries. Um,
Hmm.
there are some exceptions here. His name escaped me, but I'm reading a really interesting book right now making the case that Foucault was, or making actually tackling the arguments levied against Foucault. Um, the actual discrepancy or the problem with the view that Foucault was or wrote in print to support hoobity-doobiting the kiddies
Hmm.
is that there's a disconnect between what critics think Foucault did in practice and what Foucault presents himself as doing in the essay. Right? And again, I'm not touching the issue of what Foucault actually believed and supported here. Um, Foucault's sexual morality and the law does not actually discuss, or does not actually discuss diddly diddly doing with kids at all. What
Yeah.
it does discuss is instead it's an argument for the idea that age of consent or consent in general is a historical social construct which dates to Enlightenment era notions, so 1780s, about the nature of rationality, which Foucault and his interlocutor argue are absurd. And so this is again like so there is a type of realism undergoing here that is missing from American exegetes of Foucault, um, because consent is not actually a feature of the sexual encounter. Uh, One of the quotes they make time and time again, like there's three different interlocutors in the essay, is nobody signs a contract before making love.
Hmm.
And this leads Foucault to conclude that the idea of age of consent laws is not to penalize immoral individuals who want to kitty diddle, but instead is meant to penalize children for feeling romantic attachment, shall we say. Or it's meant to constrain and deny the possibility of romantic attachment on the parts of children.
Hmm.
So it's a very, as you can see why it's such a controversial argument, both amongst his supporters and amongst his critics. But the thrust of his argument is not that it is or is not okay to kitty diddle. Instead, it's that the concept, perception, God, language, in this case, the concept of consent is a trap, uh, in his words.
Hmm.
It's really sucks to be the Me Too movement, eh? No, it's a joke, sorry. Because people do not, love is not a contract. and therefore the law should not reflect the idea that love is or is not a contract. I'm not sure how well I explained his argument there.
Uh,
Like,
yeah. Well, it's something that may bear its own. It may require its own episode to break down. Yeah, it's pretty. It's a spicy topic, and we wouldn't want it
yeah,
to be
well,
misunderstood. So doing it carefully would probably require spending much more time on it. Hmm.
yeah, that's fair. To be clear, I absolutely hate Foucault. I'm just trying to be charitable to the guy, uh,
Sure,
by
it's admirable.
seriously recapitulating his argument, and demonstrating like we. So I mentioned earlier, like, what are the practical uses to which this narrative, post-narrative vision of reality goes? Um, there wasn't an awful lot that most of these thinkers did in their lifetimes. They were very typical academics or very stereotypical academics. So many of them, I think, participated in the '68 riots, but didn't do much else. This was one of the major things they did do, which is why, however controversial it may be, it's one of the better, or it's one of the best examples of like in what would in practice a post-concept or post-narrative philosophy look like. And the foremost answer is the abolition of the social contract. Um, and to be very clear here, Foucault presented the exact same argument when discussing. Uh, Actually, I'm not going to say what I was about to say because that would be too controversial. But these were used in a number of situations. This is a more extreme example, but we have this post-conceptual basis, and what's the application? Um, we can see that another other good examples would include challenging ideas of drug use. Um, we say, oh well, it's okay for you to consume alcohol. For those of us living in some regions, it's okay to consume everyone's favorite herb, but it's not okay to consume everyone's favorite white powder because that's a drug and drugs are harmful, so that's banned. Right.
Hmm.
And the post, if Foucault had lived to see the war on drugs, he died of AIDS. But if he'd lived to see the war on drugs, he would have published papers arguing that we were talking about drug concepts, or we were constructing a way of penalizing people, because Foucault was a first and foremost a psychologist with an interest in uh, insanity and the constraints of the mentally ill, penalizing the drug users rather than actually doing anything productive as a society.
Hmm. Yeah, obviously, you can see um, these the unacknowledged conditions of violence behind that
Yes.
idea too. Yeah,
Yeah. 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 I'm trying.
yeah. Well, fascinating. This. I mean, I really think we are neck deep into uh, postmodern thought and its consequences. I think, which is really fascinating. And we're doing. It's been really neat, Yanar, to hear you giving a fair and balanced appraisal of Nietzsche and our friend here. And so, where do you want to take us after Derrida? Where would you like to go for the next episode?
Well, I mean, if you want to talk about, do we want to maybe revisit Foucault's arguments? Otherwise,
Hmm.
I was going to look at historicism. Um, what is it? Why does it matter? Because I think people who note the falsity of the progressive view of history, and I mean the view of history here, not say progressive politics, um, tend to conclude that therefore they can jettison historicism. In one sense, they can, right? We absolutely can, and I think should, jettison these grand historical narratives about, the glorious Catholic Church being undermined by evil Protestants. Um, which is not because the Catholic Church is bad, not because Protestantism is good, but just because they are empirically false, frivolous ways of doing things that miss the real existential crises we encounter. On the other hand, postmodern, or not postmodernism, sorry, historicism targeted very specific problems that it attempted to solve. And I worry that by jettisoning historicism, we throw out in total, and just ignoring what they have to say, we throw out the baby with the bathwater. So unless we decide to revisit post-structuralism and we Foucault, Derrida, et co, we will touch on Dilthey and Hegel next week. Probably Dilthey.
Well, fantastic. Well, I hope everyone who's been tuning into these are enjoying what they're hearing so far. And I want to thank Yondar again for setting some time aside and doing this copious research and allowing me to platform this content and get it out there and get the conversation going. So we look forward to what you guys have to say in the comments. We look forward to you subscribing for more content just like this and covering a variety of topics. And we just want to thank you again and hope to see you in the next episode of the Scrollers podcast.